Yeah. Welcome, everybody.
Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, many people. My name's Roger Wilkinson. I'm the digital publications editor for TASA. I'd like to welcome you here today to listen to Annette, Brömdal and Tait talking about their research. And the topic of their talk today is navigating intimate trans citizenship while incarcerated in Australia and the US. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Annette.
Thank you so much, Roger. I will share the slide. Thank you. So just like Roger said, on behalf of everybody, part of the trans incarceration project, including those from Yale, Brown University and Vanderbilt, we want to thank TASA and especially Roger and Sally for reaching out to us and inviting us to talk about the research in the space of navigating intimate trans citizenship while incarcerated in Australia and the US. And we will also, of course, do an acknowledgement of country. Tait.
Yeah, thanks, Netta. So we'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands and waterways where we're all virtually situated for this very important TASA webinar today. So I'm personally on the lands of the Gullible people of the Bundjalung Nation in northern New South Wales, and Netta is on the lands of the Guyabal and Jarrawa peoples in Toowoomba. So we further acknowledge the cultural diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. We celebrate the continuous living cultures of First Australians and acknowledge the important contributions that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have and continue to make in Australian society and to this carceral and corporal, colonial discourse that we are conversing about today within the space of sister girls, brother boys and First Nations trans folks. So we are committed to standing and working with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. So it always was and always will be First Nations peoples' lands. So next slide. Thanks, Netta. So today's session, we're really going to look at some further acknowledgements of the contributions to this body of work and then take a look at the current trans incarceration project that we've been working on. The methodological and ethical challenges and triumphs, some of the theoretical framework and the actual navigating intimate trans citizenship while incarcerated in Australia and the US body of work. And we'll finish with a summary, closing and some ways forward and then time for questions.
Thanks, Tait. And considering also the contributors, we would like to also acknowledge the funding bodies. So in Queensland was HIV Foundation Queensland and also the university that Tait and I are part of, as well as Ding and Tara, a USQ seed grant, as well from the US side, the Yale Fund for Gay and Lesbian Studies. Of course, our industry partners, if we think here in Queensland, Queensland Council for LGBTI Health, Metro North, which is part of Queensland Health. The research team members, of course, but also very importantly, all the participants that contributed with their lived experiences that made it possible for us to share that today. And then trans community members who were part of the methodology and also part of the research team itself and around the integrity of the research project. So I'm going to give a little bit of a funnel and provide a little bit of information around the different legs that we have part of the bigger project, as well as a little literature review to contextualize some of the concerns. So if we think about the bigger project is exploring lived experiences of trans person while incarcerated. Some of that data was uniquely interviewing formerly incarcerated trans folk in Queensland, Australia. And that was between a project between 2017 and 2020. And the last data we collected from that was 2019. Then we also have a really rich archival case study approach linked to one unique individual in Queensland who was incarcerated for between 2002 and 2007. That has resulted in its own body of work and 3 publications in that space that are accepted and currently in press. And then also where we brought in our American colleagues from Vanderbilt, Yale, and Brown University by looking at lived experiences and comparing, contrasting, and looking at similarities due to the policies being quite similar in how they manage trans folk in carceral settings. But to give a little bit of a literature review to contextualize what are some of the concerns, incarcerated trans person, specifically trans women, are commonly characterized as a vulnerable population that experience significant inequalities and numerous violations, including, but not limited to, lack of gender-affirming care, various forms of harassment and assault, and in some cases, erasure of their identity. Worldwide, carceral institutions explicitly seek to govern, control, and dictate how incarcerated trans women engage with the carceral setting, with the carceral system and staff, and of course, other incarcerated persons. Albeit embedded with a narrative of ethos of optimizing safety and security, policies and practice based on hetero cis normative frameworks are implemented that in effect work to restrict the ways trans women express and enact, as well as embody intimate citizenship while incarcerated. Although trans men and gender diverse persons in carceral settings are also of concern, trans women are disproportionately affected by discrimination, violence, and other forms of victimization, restricting their access to material and financial resources, including employment and housing, translating to some trans women turning to street economics and sex work for economic survival. Now, collectively, these experiences, coupled with biased policing practices, place trans women at a higher risk of incarceration, well, first arrest and then incarceration. Now, thinking more globally, incarceration settings around the world, including Australia and the US, generally segregate and place people in either male or female facilities, according to their legal sex, meaning male or female, and more specifically, their genitalia rather than gender identity. Hence, trans women who have not engaged in the legal process of affirming gender through gender affirming surgery are generally placed in men's setting, regardless of where they wish to be actually housed. As a result, trans women across the globe incarcerated in men's settings report experiencing violence, abuse, harassment, and assault in correctional settings. Although much of this mistreatment occur at the hands of fellow incarcerated individuals, also this mistreatment is perpetrated by correctional staff and healthcare providers. Trans women incarcerated in male settings also report that disclosure of their trans identity greatly increased risk of being raped and or coerced into sexual activities by other incarcerated people. Experiences that correctional staff frequently neglect to report or even prevent. Gender-based mistreatment of incarcerated trans women by correctional officers and healthcare providers is also prevalent in the form of misnaming and or misgendering. So using incorrect name and or pronoun at times intentionally, as well as restricting access to gender-appropriate clothing, grooming items, and even medically necessary gender-affirming medical and psychological health care, including hormone therapy. Now, so in the US and Australia, the practice of placing trans women in protective custody for extended periods as a measure of safety or protection from abuse from other incarcerated people, also known as administrative segregation, and administrative detention or administrative confinement is also commonplace. So considering the mentioned physical, verbal, sexual abuse, lack of access to gender-affirming healthcare, erasure of gender identity, and unnecessary use of protective custody frequently experienced by incarcerated trans women has been linked to dire health consequences for this population. Indeed, many incarcerated trans women have been found to have elevated levels of depression, anxiety, and other salient mental health conditions, as well as engaged in self-harm, attempted in suicide, as well as surgical self-treatment such as autocastration in an attempt to cope with their untreated gender-related medical needs and care. So that's to really contextualize and situate the research within the broader literature. Now, I'm going to give you all here a little bit of some of the challenges that we in the Queensland data collection team experience, since most of you who are here and listeners later on are within the Australian context. So some of the challenges that we really experienced was in the beginning really gaining partnership and industry support, and that included some of the correctional institutions to work with because of lack of trust. Despite having some people in the facilities that we were seeking to work with being part of the research team. But from a more top level approach, our research was probably deemed somewhat threatening. So we had some serious challenges in gaining trust. Likewise, ethical concerns, that's a whole minefield on its own, gaining ethical approvals both within the research institution, but also gaining access within the correctional institution. And that was denied twice within the correctional institution. So that obviously meant we had to rethink. Marketing and recruitment was also quite challenging, and some didn't want to promote the research for us to help with recruitment. That included the promotion of the project as well. There were also concerns about participants wanting to participate out of fear. So they then didn't engage in participation because they were fearing for their future self in case they would actually end up in prison or in an carceral setting again. And if any of their data would ever be, they fear that it would be traced back to them and that they would be punished for that if they ended up in prison again. We also received from carceral settings unsolicited letters that we unfortunately couldn't make use of due to eligibility concern, which was heartbreaking because some people were writing closer to 15-page letters sharing their lived experiences while incarcerated. So because we couldn't get access to inside the prison, obviously we had to rethink. But before I go into that space, there were some serious paradoxes, obviously, with us not being able to meet with currently incarcerated people. And this irony fits quite closely with the idea of double punishment. And Ernie has defined the double punishment, also known as double imprisonment, which explains that trans people who are incarcerated are punished first by the pervasive discrimination in the judicial system that continues to fail to give legal recognition of trans people's right to dignity and self-identity. And then second, by the often cruel and unusual mistreatment of them while incarcerated. And then we can add a third, a triple punishment, by actually not allowing them to have a voice in the research by us being able to talk with currently incarcerated people. So there was this overprotection of the underprotected, and that had negative implications for advancing evidence-based practices and strategy, funding, policy, etc. And it all obviously also meant that we couldn't look at, from an insider perspective within the system, how to ensure that human rights are really upheld, including access to gender-affirming healthcare while incarcerated. So what we had to do instead was really think, well, how are we going to be able to meet with trans folk who have been incarcerated? Well, we have to think about those who had been rather than those who are. So previously incarcerated, we had to also think more of, can we scope our research project broader than just Queensland? And that's when we started doing also case studies, also reaching out to international partners. We increased our participant incentive as well. And that was another thing we had to consider from a monetary perspective. And really build trust slowly with certain organizations for them to feel comfortable promoting the research project. So the timeline of our data collection went from early 2018 till the end of 2019. And collectively, we got 6 participants. So from that perspective, it was a very drawn out data collection process. So this is now thinking about the theoretical framework. So the paper that we're focusing on today is Accepted, and we will concentrate most of our conversation linked to that for the bulk of the presentation. So in light of the many and significant harms incarcerated trans women experience while serving their sentence in men's settings, we're drawing on Ken Plummer's concept of intimate citizenship. So cis and gender normative paradigms, under what also Goffman argues are total institutions, such as carceral settings, work to discipline relationships by insisting that only opposed binary gender beings share intimacies with each other, and highlight how incarceration settings by design restrict a trans woman's opportunities and choices with respect to their personal life and self-determination. So such gender normative and regulative corporal policy conditions restrict incarcerated trans women's agency and actions in how the intimate can be imagined, portrayed, and represented. So centered around Plummer's notion of intimate citizenship, this analysis seeks to better understand the ways in which trans women navigate decision-making regarding the control they have over their body, feelings, and relationships, including their access to representations, relationship, public spaces, and their socially grounded choices regarding their identities, gender experiences, and erotic experiences, while incarcerated in facilities for men. Now, Plummer theorizes the ways in which public concerns of citizenship, belongs, and entitlement here are contested and reinforced in private lives through intimate contexts such as sexuality, gender, bodily autonomy, and relationships. And argues that for citizenship really to exist, there must be a possibility of being recognized as belonging and participating in a group where one is expected to do certain things, obligations, in return for certain rights. One achieves the status of citizenship through this. Furthermore, recent scholarship has challenged the notion of citizenship as a fixed legal status, mobilizing the concept of performative citizenship to conceptualize citizenship not as a status that describes what people are or have, but as something that people do through the claims they make and policies and practices they contest. So, however, the conceptualization of citizenship as personal and performative also draws attention to the importance of individual agency which is really at the heart of this paper, in shaping one's experience of citizenship. So as Plummer emphasizes, autonomy of choice is the key to enacting intimate citizenship, which depends on how one is placed in respect to the public and fixed aspects of citizenship, so status and resources. And he describes the subjective experience of inequalities that place people in hierarchies of esteem. So applies to sex-segregated carceral settings, and due to cis-normative constraints, which dictate how trans women may embody, express, and enact their trans identity, they are, on the one hand, highly visible and esteemed sexual targets, and on the other hand, lack status and or resources. So despite the restrictions on their intimate citizenship, Plummer argues individuals always have some kind of agency. However, the choices and the actions are indeed severely limited and often linked to inequalities such as disempowerment, brutalization, coercion, and massive lack of autonomy. Now, this agency and self-determination is at the heart of this study. And thus this analysis contributes to greater understanding of how trans women within both nations, so the US and Australia, through grit, resilience, and ingenuity, demonstrate agency by seeking to embody, express, and enact their trans intimate citizenship in creative and original ways. And this critical analysis contributes to understanding how incarcerated trans women, through grit, resilience, and integrity, still navigate ways to embody, express, and enact their trans intimate citizenship in innovative and unique ways. So really, and this is a brief positionality because that's really important to the integrity of the research we do as well, is the whole team, all the authors part of this paper and the research team see themselves as critical analysts, trans rights scholars, allies, clinicians, including trans people with lived experience of incarceration. And we're all concerned with the ways in which trans women navigate being, belonging, and becoming in relationship with within men's incarceration settings, often characterized as hyper-masculinized and hyper-sexualized environments. So this cross-national piece seeks to critically analyze the ways in which strong cis and gender normative policies and sense of self-determination collectively implicate and affect trans women's agency and actions in navigating intimacies in settings that by design restricts trans women's opportunity and choice with respect to their personal life and self-determination. So in the context of this, our research question that drives this paper is, how do incarcerated trans women navigate intimate citizenship and choose what to do with their gender, bodies, identities, representations, emotions, and desires, as well as relationships in Australia and the US. And over to you, Tait.
Thanks, Netta. So I'll be taking a look at the methods and the analytic framework that underpin this particular paper and study. So looking at the methods, this critical analysis draws on two sets of semi-structured interviews with formerly incarcerated trans women. So the first study was the one that was done in Queensland, conducted with 4 trans women through 2018 to 2019. That was funded by the HIV Foundation of Queensland. And the second study was a study with 20 trans women conducted in the US in 2015. And that was funded by the Yale Fund for Gay and Lesbian Studies. So both studies recruited participants through multiple purposive sampling strategies, which included posting paper and electronic recruitment flyers at community organisations and trans-specific websites and listservs. So eligible participants were 18 years and older, self-identified as a woman, trans women on the trans feminine or male to female spectrum. They were assigned male sex at birth, had not legally affirmed their gender, and had been incarcerated at least once in Queensland, Australia, or in a New England state in the US, so Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, or Maine. So in a men's watch house or a jail or a prison, so an incarceration setting, typically in a single or double occupancy cell or protected area such as administrative segregation, which is solitary confinement, in a men's carceral setting. So all of these carceral settings have sexual abstinence enforcing policies rather than offering safe sex options such as condoms. And at the point of the interview, participants have been incarcerated within the past 5 years for 3 or more days. So next slide, thanks, Netta. So more about the participants. They were in total 24 trans women aged 20 to 52 years with a overrepresentation of both First Nations peoples of Australia and Black American and or mixed race participants. So speaking to Ricky's question earlier, so of the US participants, 70% were trans women of colour, including Black African American or Latinx or mixed race, whereas 75% of the participants in Australia were Australians First Nations peoples. So the data was collected beginning in 2015 using one-on-one in-depth semi-structured interviews and ranging from 45 to 120 minutes. And they were conducted by 2 of the team in Australia and 1 of the team in the US. So to protect anonymity, which is really crucial, participant names were anonymised using pseudonyms, and both research projects were approved by their individual universities' ethics boards. So informants participated in interviews exploring their incarceration experiences and how they went about doing their gender, identities, bodies, emotions, desires, and relationships while incarcerated in a men's setting. So additionally, questions also focused on healthcare needs during incarceration, access to gender-affirming medical care such as hormones and surgery, factors influencing health while incarcerated, and other more general questions regarding the lived experiences of incarcerated trans women. So to make meaning of the 24 trans women's lived carceral experiences in Australia and the US, the data was analysed as one large data set due to the similar aim and nature of both nations' research projects, which sought to appreciate the lived experiences of trans women incarcerated in male settings. So including comparable interview questions and similar condom prohibiting and cis and gender normative carceral policies, which is used in both geographical settings when housing trans women who have not legally affirmed their gender. So this paper used thematic analysis in generating and defining themes, and more specifically flexibly applies Braun and Clark's 2019 revised 6-step guide informed by theoretical frameworks with the end goal of capturing the uniting idea of the theme. So as a result, there were 3 themes. The thematic analysis yielded 3 major themes. There were a couple of sub-themes, but which together define the relationships that incarcerated trans women navigate and when enacting their intimate citizenship. So the first is trans institutionalism, so self and the total institution. Second is trans intimacy, self in relation and relations with others. And the third is trans bodily sovereignty, which is expressing femininity. So these themes consider how participants engaged in trans intimate citizenship while incarcerated and are thereby regulated by cis and gender normative institutional policies and practices that punish non-normative relations and affect trans embodiment and gender expression. So moving on to, this is the first theme, trans institutionalism, self and the total institution. So all of the trans women interviewed described how cis-normative housing policies could be innovatively and proactively translated to affect alternate housing possibilities within the male setting. So especially among the US participants, the ability to navigate housing policies often depended on how familiar the person was with the male incarceration setting and system. So their previous history of being placed in the general population or protective custody and what advice they'd received prior to incarceration. So those who knew more about the system had been negatively affected by being sold in protective custody knew that they could choose to be housed in a general population environment instead, and so proactively sought to serve the majority of their sentence in general population. So although none of the Australian participants shared how they had strategically navigated and negotiated housing options, as protective custody appeared less commonly used, Elsa in Australia, which is a pseudonym, shared one experience while being housed in a high protection incarceration setting with some of the state's high profile offenders, sex offenders and pedophiles. So to ensure her safety, Elsa had been informed that she would not be put in the general population or allowed to share a cell with anyone. However, when approached by a man on her high protection block to go and ask them, the correctional officers, if you can double up with me, she confidently declined the offer as it would have jeopardised her safety, and instead said, "I don't want to double up. I'm happier to be on my own." Over to you, Netta.
Thank you. So this is the second theme with two sub-themes part of it: trans intimacy, self and relations with others. And here I'll first explore the first sub-theme, engaging in romantic relationships and indulging corporal desires. So a third of the participants across both geographical locations voluntarily engaged in romantic relationships of some form. Evie shared here, for example, "I'm hooked up in the prison sexually with this one guy, and I did a lot of time with him. I ended up just playing house with him. We did hook up. It was something I wanted. I felt comfortable. We did things in transition, like being in the shower and maybe a coffee, or, I would make his bed. He would make my bed. We would prepare like these little institutional dishes." Ellie and Ebony, both from the US, also described the formation of serious romantic relationships in the protective custody with men housed in the same space. Cassandra from the US explained the blossoming of romance with a man who offered her food when she had no money for canteen. Participants in both countries who were familiar with the prison system, as Tait explained a little bit earlier, and had been incarcerated mainly for petty crimes such as survival sex or stealing to support their drug addiction, navigated their intimate citizenship by engaging in transactional sex for goods and services. Now, as condom use is prohibited both in Queensland and in the states where the US incarceration settings, part of this, were located, participants described ways that they would manage the safety of their sexual and romantic encounters while incarcerated. So, for example, Elisa from the US and her partner mutually demanded proof they were each from and sexually transmitted infections. While Cassandra, who was living with HIV, would always use a glove to protect her partner during sex. Some participants expressed that they desperately wanted to get laid and have a boyfriend while they were incarcerated, such as Martha from the US, fully knowing that most of these relationships were limited to the correctional setting and would not translate into a lasting relationship on the outside. However, others refused to engage in any form of romantic or corporal relationships, as they set particular standards, they argued, and did not want to bend over for anyone, as it would be denouncing, they argued, or reduce themselves to the level of fucking everyone. And because there's a lot of disease in jail, such as what Gemma from Australia said. Quite dissimilar to this ethos, Sandra from the US, who for the first time experienced being viewed as a woman compared to in the free world, now felt affirmed and expressing her femininity and sexuality for the first time. And she said, "I felt like I was a star. And I learned how to hustle, but more importantly, just having the sex was just freeing for me because I interpreted sex for love. I thought this was love. So when someone didn't stay around, I didn't care because I know in an hour I'll be in someone else's cell. So I thought I was beautiful. Every queen there is thought they were the only one, which was good. Sandra also built trust with the correctional officers so that she was able to influence the decision about whom she would share the cell with. She reports that she would manipulate the boys into wanting to share a cell with her. And this is from her own words. You know, I thought I was an intelligent person. I would manipulate the boys, you know. So, and that's what I ended up doing. I've had guys and that would start trouble with their roommates. So he could be moved out of the cell and they would go and say, we're not getting along. And they'd go, so who do you get along with? Do you want, and who do you want in there? Put Sandra in there. Sandra, do you want to move? Yeah, I'll move. And that was some of the ways she worked that to ensure she could be in a cell with the person she wanted to be romantically and sexually with. So Sandra's sophisticated navigation of the system suggests an active engagement in her intimate citizenship, one she did not feel permitted to pursue in the free world. Now, the second sub-theme within the trans intimacy, self and relations with other is transacting corporal services. And participants in both countries who were familiar with the prison setting, like I argued before, they navigated their intimate citizenship by engaging in transactional sex for goods and services. Luna here from Australia, she expressed, I did not have my family support. So I'd go into prison, I'd be on my own, more or less. So just having access to getting and buying things was very difficult for me because I have to do sex for favors, including accessing cigarettes, electrical items, money, drugs, and protection. She was not alone in trading sex for goods and favors. Ellie from US and Sierra and Taylor as well from the US also survived their prison sentences by offering sex and their bodies for contain. Ellie here expressed that she would basically do what I did on the streets, flirt around with guys, give them a little bit of something here, you know. I basically did what I had to do to survive up in here. I have the things I want. Similarly, Nadia from the US expressed how she gave oral sex for food and goods to an officer. And she says in her own words, a lieutenant was bringing me Kentucky Fried Chicken and a pack of Newports, so that's cigarettes, a brand in the US, and sending everybody to the gym and letting me specifically stay. And then I gave him oral sex. Some participants, however, reported that they were not willing to trade sex for goods while incarcerated. So for instance, Jasmine from the US stated that she was not willing to have sex with the men or the correctional officers on her block due to the risk of HIV, and instead offered non-contact sexual favors, such as a flash of a titty, in her own words, in exchange for canteen goods. The participant also described strong arm sex, where one engaged in sexual activities in return of protection. And this was something that occurred for the participants in both countries. And this included performing sexually appealing catwalks for correctional officers, as well as entering into contractual corporal relationships for protection. And Ebony from the US explained how her strong arm sex experience meant she was actually auctioned off in return for safety. And in her own words, she said, and what would happen is guys that knew they were going to be there for a while would do what any guy would do when they see a woman, you know, try to pick her up. So the guy would like, I want to say, auction you off, but they would communicate that they were going to choose you as their girl and you would be protected or whatever, but they would expect certain needs fulfilled. Some of the trans women, regardless of where they were housed and despite their sexuality and pressures to respond, navigated the discourse of transacting corporal services by declining to engage with requests from men, including correctional officers who sought sex in return for goods, services, and favors. So, for example, when Ebony was in protective custody, she refused several correctional officers offering her food, including McDonald's, in return for sexual acts. And Luna for Australia, which is the second larger quote on the PowerPoint slide there, also shared how a prison officer came into her cell one night and wanted her to undress for him. The prison officer came into my cell at night, and the other prisoner could see him opening my cell and coming in. So then I had a witness to what was actually happening. And he just asked me to take off my clothes. And I said, why? And he said, I just want to see what you look like without your clothes on. And I sat there and I sank. I felt really vulnerable because I was in such an isolated position. And then he had the power. And I just said, look, I'm not comfortable doing that. And I don't want to do that. He asked a couple more times. He said, oh, just for a little bit. It won't take long. And I just said, look, I just don't want to do it. And I don't feel comfortable. And so he left. The next day I complained about it and they didn't really do anything. So I asked for a specific complaints form. So I put in a report for my complaint form and asked them to give me a copy of it. And then pretty much straight away, they were acting on it and come and told me that afternoon I was being moved. Here, Luna stressed that she knew she had to complain formally with a copy of the complaint in her hand, and only then would the correctional officers act on it. Otherwise, in her own words, they would have been quite happy to sweep it under the carpet and try to ignore it. This is
Thanks.
over to you, Tait.
Yeah, thanks, Nida. So the third theme speaks to trans bodily sovereignty, expressing femininity, and this is the last theme. So participants described elaborate and unique ways to embrace, express and perform their femininity while incarcerated. Most of the carceral settings did not allow the participants to access clothing or grooming or hygiene, commissary items, including undergarments consistent with their gender expression. And while both Gemma and Elsa in Australia were allowed to wear their own underwear, Gemma explains that this was limited. They took my bra off me because they reckon it was lingerie and it's sexual. But then they gave me my underwear back and I had to wash them in the sink every night to wear them every day. So I wasn't wearing male underwear. Similar to Gemma, Taylor in the US was able to access women's underwear, but through different means. She says, I had some inmates, also friends, making me sexy underwear. So makeup was also considered contraband in all the participants' carceral settings. So, however, many of the US participants described creative ways that they made their own cosmetics in order to express their femininity. So Taylor expressed, I wasn't willing to give up my femininity, even though she knew that she might be caught and penalised, and would go into canteen with the help of magic markers, do my nails, and with the help of coffee, mix it up, and then with a toothbrush, put mascara on, and with the fishnet laundry bags, make fishnet stockings. Alicia in the US also explained I would buy M&Ms and wet the M&Ms and take the red colour off the M&Ms and then use them like lipstick, as well as make her own eyeliner. So around the windowsill, she also explained, there's like a black type of glue or whatever, but with the pen, you could take some of that black glue and then you took Vaseline and then you would get, like from the nurses, and you would put a little Vaseline into the mix. And when you put the Vaseline on it, it would actually make it look like black eyeliner. So Elle in the US was not allowed to wear jewellery. And so instead, she would take bread ties and make little earrings like bows. Half of the participants also expressed their femininity by growing nails. So Carling in the US shaving off unwanted hair, Alicia, L, Sierra, Brandy in the US and Gemma in Australia, and grooming their head hair, Taylor, Brandy, Carly, Nadia in the US and Gemma in Australia also. So Gemma spent a large portion of her morning styling her hair. She explained, I'd wake up at 5 a.m. and brush my hair until about 6:30 a.m. because I get self-conscious, and I was in a jail full of men and I was the only girl. So I'd brush my hair for hours and try to look as good as I can without makeup and any of that stuff in male clothes. So due to the hyper-masculinized and sexualized carceral environment, Elle and Sandra in the US, both with a history of incarceration, took on the role of protecting trans women and providing advice on how to survive their sentence. So in Sandra's case, she had acquired the name Queen Bee because of the accumulated respect she had gained among other incarcerated persons and staff throughout the years, and because she paved the way for other trans women housed on her block. So she expressed, I paved the way as Queen Bee because I'd been in every prison and I'd been entrapped in that environment so long that, you know, they had to respect me. Then, you know, you respected the people that were around me and in my atmosphere. And those were usually my daughters. I called them, these are my daughters. And because of me being in and out, like I could not survive 6 months in the 30-year period. This was my miracle here. So Sandra also earned the reputation of don't mess with me due to the number of fights she had won with men, including knocking one unconscious. One other participants such as Sabrina, Brandy and Cassandra in the US also earned their respect when unapologetically slapping or lashing out at men who had insulted them in various ways for being a trans woman. Others would choose to correct and educate correctional officers who either seemed ignorant about trans people or who kept misnaming and misgendering them. So Alicia and Carly in the US and Gemma in Australia. Similarly, in Brandy's case in the US, she educated other incarcerated trans persons about what it meant to be a trans woman and how she could present herself when unable to express her femininity. So next slide. So these are really the concluding remarks of this particular paper and study. So incarcerated trans women are typically positioned as vulnerable populations who are victims of a cis-normative system that does not recognise their identity. However, this analysis has shown how the enactment of intimate citizenship by trans women in Australia and the US challenges the notion of citizenship as an exclusively public and fixed, even within a totalistic institution. So within the cross-geographical incarceration setting, these trans women assert their familiarity with both the formal and informal rules of the carceral environment, forging vertical and horizontal connections which enable them to assert themselves as intimate citizens. So these findings also underscore there is further room for trans women to actively embody, express and enact their intimate citizenship, which could be realised by both nations embracing a whole incarceration setting approach, upholding the needs and rights of trans women. So in light of these findings, it's important also to highlight that much of the literature on gender diversity and carceral experiences focuses on trans women. And although some of these experiences may be felt by other trans and gender diverse identities, further research is needed to better understand their challenges while incarcerated and how they in turn assert themselves as intimate citizens. So, and further consideration of the overrepresentation of Black, Indigenous and people of colour in incarceration settings within and outside Australia and in the US. Further inquiry of intimate citizenship could focus explicitly on the relationship between Plummer's notion of intimate inequalities in relation to the many intersections at play, including disability within these vulnerable populations of incarcerated trans women.
Thanks, Tait. And I know that Roger had a bit of a slide in the background when starting the presentation, but this is to just showcase some of the papers that have come out of the larger trans incarceration teams body of work. And Tait just had one of their pieces published on Saturday, which is this one here, In Punishment and Society, Trans Architecture and the Prison as Archive. Don't be a queen and you won't be arrested. And the piece that we've talked about today is accepted in feminism and psychology, and should be coming out hopefully by the mid of this year at least, considering the time it takes for things to be actually published. So if there's any, of course, papers that you'd like to have and you can't access them, please let us know, and we're more than happy to provide them in PDFs, or if Roger seeks to provide them to you. Thinking about just where to next, this is a really exciting thing that is happening right now, and on Monday, especially here in the Toowoomba region of southwest Queensland. So we have an artist, a renowned New Zealand artist by the name of Shannon Novak, who identifies within the rainbow community and is an artist who seeks to bridge LGBTI health and wellbeing concerns through art. And he's coming on the weekend over to Toowoomba for 2 weeks as a residential artist. And we're opening the art gallery that has been refurbished here in Toowoomba with Shannon Novak's exhibition, Make Visible. And we will have 2 of the artistic pieces there that speaks specifically to trans and incarceration. And yeah, we feel very, very privileged to be able to express the data that we've collected by expressing it through other modes and means such as art. So that's happening next week. And really that's it from us. And I realize we haven't put our Rick Spencer, I can see you have your email address. So very happy to email you all our publications that we have, Rick. Thank you. I know we only have like 7 minutes left, but yeah, I'll stop sharing the PowerPoint. Or has that has been done already? Great.
That's okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, both Tait and Netta. We do have time for questions, and we can certainly go over the hour. And it would be interesting if you were able to provide us, perhaps email either Sally or myself, any information about Shannon Novak, and we would be able to repurpose that through Twitter and some of the other social media. So we can do that. Okay. So has anyone got any questions or comments that they would like to make?
Oh, yes, please. I'm so excited by this research. As you know, it really touches my heart as a transgender woman from Stolen Generation. It really means so much to me that you have taken your time and really expressed some of the experiences that, you know, many of my friends have experienced, especially incarceration and the stigma and shame. And one of the things I was fascinated, and I guess it's just sort of my own looking within prisons and experiences of trans women, is in America, did you find that, you know, how prisons are kind of along racial lines, where when a prisoner comes in, was the fact of the trans woman kind of treated differently? Because normally, you know, if you associate with the African American community, you'd go there, or these Hispanic. Was this the case with trans women, or were they seen as women, and it was like, yeah, wherever they would go for the dominant prison groups?
Great question, Ricky. Tate, did you want to have a crack at that? Or
yeah, I'll have a go. Yeah, so we didn't explicitly focus on, I guess, that to me that would form part of sort of intersectionality and looking at that really broadly, particularly in the US. You know, it seems that there's some difference there to an Australian population. So whilst we didn't focus on that explicitly, you know, the trans women that were interviewed articulated really sort of similar experiences across the nations around either being over-sexualised or hypersexualised, or on the other sort of, I guess, end of that scale, which is that idea of transphobia, and experiences of transphobia. So misgendering, misnaming, really poor treatment, rape, victimisation. So I think that would be a great study going forward, like to look at that role of how intersectionality is different even across the nations as well.
Mm.
Yeah, like
I'm very fascinated. I'm just so excited. Yeah. I can't wait to talk to you both more, because the other thing, that one of my areas of projects I'm involved with is at the Parkville Remand Centre, building up new resources for Indigenous LGBTIQ young people. And my interest area is supporting trans and gender diverse Indigenous populations within settings. And this is wonderful because it gives a kind of breadth. Have you at all thought about doing something like that, extending your project to look at young incarcerated people within Australia? Because to me, this is an area that has been not really, really kind of broached, or almost non-existent. And I would be very excited if I heard you say yes or thought about it, or we could get fun, because to me, I hear so many stories about unsafe practices and violence that's not talked about because we're Black, we're queer, and we're trans.
Can I just, before I answer that, but a quick yes, we are. But let me also answer, maybe build on what Tait was saying earlier. We actually have in press a paper, that intersectional paper in the International Journal of Correctional Healthcare, that specifically look at oppression to incarceration cycle of Black American and First Nations Australian trans women. And we uniquely,
darling, because I will promote it everywhere, because I'm so excited, because I think, sorry everyone for bringing up, this is one of the areas I'm passionate too. There's so much stigma that people put on people being incarcerated. And it's like, you wear this, for a lot of people telling me, lifelong. All the being Black, being trans, and then having a record, you're seen as a bad person, not to be trusted. And I'm trying to really dismantle that, disrupt that kind of that way of looking at people. So thank you so much to both of you for creating a sense that we are all people, and we all make mistakes, but sometimes we've got to understand what is happening in incarcerated spaces. And in some ways there's positivity in terms of affirmation of who you are as a trans woman, but also the fact that you're the vulnerabilities of that, and to deal with. Thank you.
I think a really, if I may put a plug for Tait's paper as well, there's a really unique aspect of trans women of First Nations background, a quote. I just like to read it because I think that highlights also that intersectionality and otherness of what a trans woman should look like. So this is coming from Luna, who we talked about as well in this Intimate Citizenship paper. And she had serious concerns about the discrimination faced by first Australian trans incarcerated people, and that they're increased. It's increased as many from remote communities actually do not have access to gender affirming hormones, and therefore maybe not recognized as trans. And this is in her own words. The other thing that really concerns me about our prisons is that the idea of what actually a transgender person is as well. A lot of the time they do it based on how you look. And I think there's a lot of Aboriginal trans women, they go into prison and they might not fit into the picture of what a trans woman's supposed to look like, because they've come from a community where they may not have access to hormones. So it's important to contextualize socioeconomically, regionally, access. There's so many things. So plug for Tait's paper there, but also thinking of what you said earlier about youth. So we have currently a systematic literature review that uniquely explores across the world trans youth in the youth juvenile system and looks at how school settings of not feeling belonging, that very early abuse of bullying, shaming, stigma is a pipeline into the youth juvenile system that then is another pipeline into the adult, and how to break that cycle has to happen very, very early. So that's a paper we have under review as well, Ricky. Thank you for your wonderful questions and just affirmation.
Thank you, all of you and Ricky. Any other questions from the audience or comments?
Can I maybe just ask, sorry, what can we do? Like, what do you see as part of my, I guess, PhDs? I'm all about disruption theory, as I call it, which is how can we put steps into change? You know, what can we do? What could I ask, what would you both advocate that we can do as scholars and community of, you know, who have some, have privilege in writing, and that what could we take steps to support, I guess, understanding and supporting trans men and trans women and gender non-conforming people who are incarcerated? What actions could we take?
I'm making a bullet list in my own head. Tate, you can go first if you want.
Look, I mean, I think that firstly acknowledging that, yeah, you know, I mean, I have, I'm a trans person myself, and I, you know, but I recognise that I am, you know, a non-Indigenous trans person, which affords me a level of privilege. I do have my own incarceration experiences, but as an academic, my voice has afforded a whole lot of you know, hearing that others aren't. So I do think research that really situates the trans person's voice, you know, in the foreground is really important. That's one thing, and that is focused on the layers, the complexity, like what you're talking about around intersectionality, and really, I think looking at, you know, the situation here in particular, and how that's different even across different states of Australia, you know, for non-Indigenous and Indigenous people. So I think that's, yeah, you know, positionality is really important, and bringing forward the voice of the trans incarcerated person, whether that's previously or currently, are two things. And look, I mean, you know, just having opportunities to speak like this, saying yes, I guess, is what I think. Like saying yes, we're asked to speaking about what is actually going on currently. Yeah, there's some of the things. Netta, have you got?
Yeah,
others?
Thank you, Tate. Thank you. Thinking about the context of exactly making visible. So these opportunities, writing papers, being at conferences, and raising awareness in general is making its impact in diverse pockets of society. What I think is really important is working with the community, working with trans folk who have been incarcerated and not incarcerated, along the spectrum of intersectionality as well. Policy suggestions, work with policy makers is really crucial. So I've had, together with Tait, had the, you know, honour as well to provide feedback on policies, both in the Northern Territory, but also in Victoria, around what could be made around the LGBTIQA+, and uniquely around trans and people born with intersex variations, to make their experience more affirming while serving their sentence.
Could I quickly suggest to both, sorry everyone, but I'm so excited about this. And so have you thought about having, like, getting funding for a co-design group of people who have been incarcerated trans women, and maybe producing like a booklet that then can be kind of be allowed to be in prison? So what to expect, how to manage to navigate safety boundaries, because for me, I always imagine myself, because it could happen to anybody to be incarcerated, what you go through, what are your rights, because hearing the story that you told about, and I'm bad with memory, with the person who was approached by the guard, because that shows me the strength of character, to know that yes, you can be affirmed, but you have a right to choose who can see your body, or who are allowed to touch. And I thought this is something that we're looking at juvenile justice as more and more lived experience storytelling in language that is understood. And I was wondering if perhaps you both would be open to perhaps something like that, or exploring as part of your research going forward, looking at that language.
Look, absolutely. And I think one of our papers that we had in 2019, it's an editorial in the then called International Journal of Transgenderism. It has been renamed to International Journal of Transgender Health. There we provide an outline of what a whole incarceration setting approach in supporting and upholding the rights and health of incarcerated trans folk should look like. And it goes through anything from policy to, private matters, training, to celebrating Ida Hobart Day and so forth. But I think going one step back to what you were saying earlier, Ricky, working with the carceral system is paramount, because we can look at certain states that are building more and more maxi prisons and thinking from a philosophy and principle standpoint of rehabilitation versus punitive approaches, down the line to even abolishment theories. So there's a lot of that can be thought about. And of course, preferably in a proactive, promoting health that happens early rather than fixing the problem. And it might even be worse through the experiences in the carceral setting. Love heart, love it. We do have plans, Tait and the team, to develop an ARC as well, which will look at some aspects that you were talking about, Ricky, and this would be a great opportunity to reach out to you if you'd like to.
Please, darling, I'm very interested, very keen, and want to help, because I'm all about reducing suicide rates and self-harm, and it starts with in schools, which is my area, I guess, plug, but also youth incarceration, prisons in all, which all they do is internalize stigma and hate, and we have to treat people as human beings. And prisons are not the solution. They are part of the problem. We have to look at why do people in fact go into prisons, and look at ways to support people better. So I am for you. Let me help spread the love and message. I will do everything in my power. Thank you so much both, because doing this type of research means a lot to us and our community. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricky.